Hello everybody, my name is Ratnos, and welcome to This Week in Mythic Plus. This week's affixes are Tyrannical, Raging, nearly forgot the affix there for a sec, Quaking, and of course Prideful. This is an interesting week for a couple different reasons. Reason number one, it's the last week that we haven't seen yet this expansion. Starting next week, we're going back up to Bursting Volcanic Fortified, which was the first week of the season. And then we'll be rotating through these 12 affix weeks for the remainder of this patch. My suspicion is we'll probably go back through each affix once, and then we'll probably be in 9.1. So maybe 1.5 more goes through this, because 12 weeks, that's about 3 months, right? So my suspicion is that we've had kind of a warm-up go of each week, and then we'll have the for realsies versions of each week. And by the time we get back to these first ones, obviously a tremendous amount has changed since we were doing the very first M+ of the season. Everybody has way more gear, and a lot of the dungeons have received serious nerfs. One big nerf, of course, is the Tyrannical nerf, where Tyrannical now only increases boss HP by 30% rather than by 40%. We saw this in play in the week number 10 here, the Bursting Explosive Tyrannical. Doesn't quite seem like it was enough. From the statistics I've been looking at on Raider.io, it doesn't quite seem like it was enough to bring a huge representation of Tyrannical keys. I was looking at, so I've looked at both the very front page of Raider.io. Here's 2,000 pages in. You can see there's still a lot more of the fortified keys up there than the Tyrannical ones, and the very front pages are extremely fortified dominant still. My suspicion is that will continue to be the case. My suspicion is that even this week, I think that this is a less favorable Tyrannical week for the really high keys than the 1-2 weeks ago. Because Raging and Tyrannical, and this is actually for everybody, not just for those really high key pushers, Raging Tyrannical is a bit of a nasty combination, because Tyrannical requires you to be doing these big trash pulls, right? If you want to be, so if you're in one of those high level keys, or even if you're in sort of any kind of key where the timer is at all close for you, so wherever your group is at, if you're in that situation where you're in a key where it's going to be based on like the timer rather than whether you're wiping or not, then this is a week where the Raging and Tyrannical affixes are really pulling you in two different directions, because Raging is a very punishing affix if you are pulling a lot of enemies at once, particularly if you're playing without a Soothe. Most groups will have access, not most groups I guess, but many groups will have access to a Soothe effect. You got rogues that can do it this expansion. Of course, if you're playing a rogue, be aware of the fact that your Shiv can dispel the Raging. And of course hunters, druids can do it as well. So that does help out, but you're only targeting one mob. So if you're doing a really large pull, you do need to be careful. Really, this expansion, tanks are pretty used to kiting, so they'll just have to do that, and the mobs get low. If you're fighting a lot of enemies at once, even if you're fighting one pack at a time, don't be caught off guard by Raging. Raging makes mobs hit way harder. Raging Tyrannical mobs hit way harder when they're Raging than like a regular Fortified mob does. It's still almost twice as hard. Fortified doesn't increase mob damage by that much. Compared to how much Raging doubles their damage. It's a lot, so run away from them when they are big and red, or use a big defensive. Do anything you can to help out your tanks in that time. Consider saving AoE crowd control effects. A lot of groups will go in, fire off their AoE crowd control after maybe their first set of cooldowns, or even before their first set of cooldowns. This week, you might want to consider delaying those to be at the end of the pack rather than the start of the pack, so that your tank, particularly, as the mobs are hitting 30%, you can fire them off, and then your tank can create some distance. That's one approach that I find to be helpful. The Quaking aspect is certainly, it's an affix that will come into play in about half the dungeons, I'd say, this expansion, are ones where Quaking is noticeable either in more than just a couple of trash pulls, or on some bosses. So look out for that affix as well. There's a lot of dungeons, like the other side's a pretty good example of it, where there are actually some fairly narrow corridors in this dungeon that you should look out for. So without further ado, let's go dungeon by dungeon, talk about what the plan is in each of them. If you're interested in my routes, they're available on Raider.io, the Raider.io weekly route. Link will be in the description below for that. And you can pick them up. I have a route with skips and without skips for each dungeon. These routes have pretty much stabilized. There's 1 or 2 routes that have gotten some overhauls this week, but for the most part, they're pretty stable from week to week at this point, because there's not too much pressure on the routes to change on any given week, except for when we get to bullstring weeks. That'll be a big thing that changes some of them. So if you have the last week's routes, you can just keep using those. Theater of Pain is the big dungeon where I've made some serious tweaks to with Skips 1, which we'll talk about when we get there. But we're not there yet. As always, we'll start off as this order ordains with D Other Side. So D Other Side, you've got a couple of nasty Quaking spots. This area is not too bad. The really nasty area I've found has been this area in the Mechagon wing, particularly if you're trying to like avoid pulling these. Which sometimes you will, not pull these, and you're kind of fighting in a little cramped space here, or you're line of sighting one of these things around a little wall. Everybody's stacked up, Quaking comes out, so be ready for that. If you can, try and fight this thing in a spot where you can maybe have 2 different places that you can go and spread and line it, or you're ranged in a different spot than where your melee are. And as the tank, potentially be ready to tank this, as long as it's not raging and it's not a super high key. You can usually do it with the defensive. So that's the main area where Quaking is going to get you. Raging and nasty raging combos, these Risen Warlords, they have a natural enrage of their own that also doubles their damage and makes them immune to dying for 12 seconds. So while they are, if this happens when they're at like 5% health, you've got this thing that's just at 0 HP, but it can't die for another 10 seconds, chasing your tank around, doing either triple or quadruple damage. I don't know if these are additive or multiplicative with each other. But either way, it's enough that you do not want to get autoed, so run away from those. Soothe them as a priority if you can, so you can try and kill him. But yeah, that's definitely a big thing to watch out for, is these guys. All right, let's move on to Halls of Atonement. Halls of Atonement, not a dungeon that is too nasty on Quaking unless you're trying to like thread a needle in the starting area, or potentially an echelon. Just make sure that you're not stacked up on each other as the stone or as the Curse of Stone is resolving, turning you all into turn to stones. That's something that you want to try and plan ahead for. Similarly with Halkias, this is a boss that can get you in trouble with Quaking as well. So try and what you want to do is you want to kind of pollute one area of the room and then move right when we're getting close to the Refracted Sunlight cast. This is mostly going to be on the tank. It's mostly just the tank's job. To be aware of when this thing is coming and move the boss. You already need to be doing this so that there's a channel for your group to run through of the rubble, but it's especially important this week because you really want more than just a little bit of space. You want enough space that if there's a Quake overlap, you're not going to get in too much trouble. All right, Mists of Tirna Scythe. I would say not too bad at all in the Quaking department. You just got to be a little bit careful. The raging side as well. The nasty mobs, like the Tiernan villagers, for instance, actually not bad with raging at all because they stop and heal you when they get low on health. So they don't actually spend much time at all, if any, in that raging window. So don't have to worry too much about those. You do want to watch out for the mobs here. Is it the Soul Cleavers? Yeah, okay. So the Soul Cleavers do this Hand of Throws thing where they get big and they attack really fast and every auto heals them. All mobs, once they drop below 30%, will get that enrage effect. It doesn't go away if they heal themselves above 30%. So you want to watch out. One thing that can go wrong here, particularly if you like half wipe to this pack, is this thing can just heal back up to 50% health and still be enraged and keep chasing you. And that can cause you a lot of problems. So make sure that you're killing these things when they are getting below 30% health. Make sure that they ideally are just not hitting your tank when they're affected by Hand of Throws here. So if you need to, you can always use stuff like stuns to help at this time, or of course your tank can run away. So that's another pack that can potentially be problematic. I guess another area where that could happen to you is the regeneration. You also got to watch out for this. This cast is already bad if it goes off when everything's at low health, but the fact that they will retain their raging, not great either. And yeah, I mean, just obviously watch out for Quaking in all the narrow spots here. Usually you can fight these in place where the Quaking isn't going to be too bad, but depending on what you're doing to avoid this patrol, you might be in a situation where you're caught between Quaking somebody and pulling extra mobs, so try and plan ahead so that doesn't happen to you. Plaguefall. So Raging works a little bit to our benefit here, but mostly I would say it's a detriment that you're having to, oftentimes you're kind of finagling these mobs while they're low on health, and I don't know if that's the right word for it, but there's a lot of finesse to this area of the dungeon, and the mobs spend quite a bit of time on low health, particularly if things go a little bit wrong. So Be ready to do whatever you need to do as a tank to kite at the end of these pulls, or to stay in. If you need to stay in so that you can land a barrel or you can land a plague boar or whatever, even if things are raging, you got to find a way to make that happen. So that's going to be defensive management and big external cooldowns, a lot of CC, all that kind of stuff. Trying to save as much as you can for the end of the pull. And you can even do a little bit of like kiting near the start of a pull before there's a positional requirement of where you have to be, right? So you can go in, make a little bit of threat, kite while the mobs are at 80%, and then as you're getting to the point where you actually need them to be in a certain position for a barrel or whatever, that is when you actually start face tanking them, and you've saved all your defensives for that. So that's a way that you can potentially manage this area a little bit more safely. Beyond that, I don't have too much for you in this place. Let's go on to Sanguine Depths. Okay, so Sanguine Depths, this is a dungeon that is one of the harshest with any of these kind of positional affixes, which I would certainly lump Quaking into that category. Also a pretty harsh raging dungeon, so also a pretty harsh tyrannical dungeon. Really, one might just say it's a harsh dungeon, so be ready for that. Be ready for all three of these affixes, and kite stuff when it's low on health. Think about if you're the tank in this position, you want to be thinking about fighting stuff in a place where you have a safe path to kite, right? Where you've got a place that you can go that is ideally not going to lose you too much time and definitely not going to pull stuff that you don't intend to pull. So, for instance, one thing that tanks will sometimes do is they'll sort of group stuff up kind of right in the middle of where it was, and then they're in this spot where, so okay, like say you're fighting this pack, right? Or you're doing this double pull, right? And one option that I think works pretty well is to pull everything up to here, and then you can start kiting backwards away from the pack. Another good option that gives you a little bit less space, it's a little bit less infinite in terms of how much space you have, is to pull this pack back to here and fight back here. Obviously, you're kind of constrained by the lantern if you are using that, so it's just a question of whether you're at the front of the lantern or the back of the lantern. And then you would start kiting when the pack is over this way. This is faster because you're kiting in the direction you want to go, but you are constrained by the fact that you can't go past here, right? So it's a lot more finite of a kiting path. So pick between those things consciously, make a decision, and then stick to it with that. Potentially use stuff like Ursul's Vortex or AoE stuns or whatever to reverse direction if you need to, whenever you've got a decision like that going on. But the main point that I want to make here is that both of these plans are totally fine. They're very workable plans. Don't pick the middle path. Don't fight like in the middle, because it's just worse either way, right? Like whatever your plan is, whichever direction you're going to kite, you either have less space if you're going this way. I guess it works just as well if you're going backwards, but you also have less space going backwards than if you'd started fighting up here, and you'll be further away than where you want to go at the end as well. So either way, you're less happy if you start in the middle than if you pull a pack right up to the front of where you might want to be, or you pull it nice and way back and then you kite forwards. That sort of stuff. It's not super important as long as you've managed to avoid pulling extra stuff. It doesn't matter too much, but if you're trying to optimize a little bit for time, that's something that can help you out. Okay, Spires of Ascension. Don't have too much for you in terms of theory in this dungeon. It's a nasty dungeon with the fact that you have these targets you want to focus damage into, but also raging is going on. So I mean, it's not that nasty actually, because it kind of naturally, the affix sort of plays itself. I'm going to reverse my position on this. The affix kind of plays itself, right, in that you get the squad leader low, kill it, and none of the other stuff is raging, so you actually aren't dealing with like a lot of stuff being raging for prolonged periods of time. Sort of works out nicely for you. Main thing you want to do is avoid having something raging when you are focusing something else down. Don't accidentally single target one of these animals down to 30% and then switch off of it for a long period of time. That sort of thing would be bad. The main thing though that I wanted to share with you guys, those who haven't seen this before, and I've mentioned this a couple times in a couple different places, but I feel like it's actually a good tip for Spires of Ascension, is this Inky Black Potion. So Inky Black Potions, you can buy them from your auction house. They're, I don't know, between like 2 and 50 gold, depending on what server you're on, what time it is, who's selling them on the market. and it changes the look of a place that can be potentially really bright to being potentially tolerable, more tolerable for our fragile gamer eyes that are used to the darkness. So consider picking these up if you're going to this dungeon, because watch what happens to my face here when I right-click this buff off, right? Like, light mode. That's bad. I'm gonna buy another Inky Black potion right now to preserve my delicate eyes. Inky Black potion. Yeah, you see 40 gold right now on my server. Purchase one of those. Preserve all of our eyeballs for a little bit. Okay, so that's not the best advice. But you know what? That might be more helpful than the kind of general ramblings that I do for most dungeons, so I'll take it. Let's go on to Necrotic Wake. Necrotic Wake, I also don't have too much for you here. This is a dungeon that, I don't know, the same sort of strategy, whether you've been using my plans or your own plan, the same basic idea should work this week as it usually does. Of course, you're going to want to make sure that you execute this area correctly, and particularly you're going to want to make sure that you execute this area correctly, because the penalties when Raging is active for screwing up these things are going to be one-shotting you at a lot lower key levels than they otherwise would be. You can make use of the Raging affix a little bit by buffing up a Fleshcrafter. Their Throw Cleaver is buffed by Raging. It's not buffed by Bolstering anymore, so when we get to a Bolstering week, that's not going to help actually anymore, but it does still benefit from Raging. So you can still get double damage. If you want to do something in this room that a lot of people will do is they'll pull this guy and they'll just get this thing low, and they'll just leave it off to the side and keep its cleavers coming in for the rest of the pulls. Or where's the other one that does it? Yeah. So you could do that with either one or both, depending on how comfortable you're feeling. It's that kind of decision. I have a different advice depending on what sort of group you're in. If you're in like a pug situation, I'd basically never try and do something like that. If you're in a more coordinated group, a group of friends or something, I would advise trying to learn how to do that if you're in any situation except one where the timer's like medium, right? So if you have like enough time that you can probably do the rest of the dungeon, but you don't really want to wipe, then don't try and do those just play it safe, get your time. But if the timer's going to be close, then maybe you actually want to do it so that you can time the key, right? If you need to do it for time, that sort of strategy is good. And it's good, therefore, I would say, to just try hard strategies, try the difficult things if you're in any sort of group, or if you're a player like a tank that can dictate things, potentially, and manage the movement of those sorts of mobs yourself. Making things harder for yourself is a good way to make them easier in the long run, right? Or learn a new skill in the long run. So particularly if you're ever feeling bored in a dungeon, just try and pull an extra pack, or try and do something weird and see if it works out for you. And then obviously, as you start getting to a point where it's like, okay, we got to stop messing around. We're going to deplete this key. You obviously got to ease off a little bit. But I'm a firm believer in experimentation and biting off more than you can chew so that you can learn how to chew it. It's not really a Necrotic Wake thing only, but Necrotic Wake is the dungeon where I would say this happens the most, because there's a lot of stuff that's theoretically possible in this dungeon, particularly with good usage of the weapons, and the groups, particularly if you're going to play with a group together more than once. Learning how to do those is going to mean that you can do this dungeon much more efficiently than if you're unwilling to take those risks, and your ceiling will be a lot higher. But of course, spectacular failures will also happen. All right, Theater of Pain. This is the dungeon where we've had a pretty significant pathing change. This actually came from somebody who Discord DM'd me a set of changes for this dungeon that I actually thought was really cool. So this is Hellboy Lol. Shout out to Hellboy Lol, who sent in a Theater of Pain strategy that accomplishes the goal of getting Pride onto all three of the wing bosses without doing that U-turn thing. Or any of the double U-turn things. I've had a lot of different ways of accomplishing this goal, and this was a pretty elegant way that I thought was pretty good, so I want to show it off this week. So the idea is you go to Kultharok's wing first, and you add in this little double pull of Bone Magi off to the side here. They can come in during this pull, particularly if you have a Purge effect, not anything that's too dangerous at all. You purge off the Bone Shields, and they have pretty low amount of health. You kill them off nice and easy. They can either come in after the focus target in this pull dies, or at the start of the pull if you're feeling up to it, if you got a lot of AoE damage or crowd control effects, which this is a good pull for it, so you might well have that. If you have something like Wild Spirits going on, for instance. Or you can just do it after. You can split this up into 2 pulls. And so then that gets us Pride after this pull. So we have 40% Pride into Kultharok. Then we go Gore Chop. We do the first pull of Gore Chop Wing, and then we skip. We either Shroud or Invis Pot. So this is the with skips route, so obviously don't do this if you don't have skips. You can use my other route, and you get 2 out of 3 bosses with Pride. Totally fine. But so here you'd use a Shroud or you'd use Invis Pots. You do this pull, go on downstairs, kill off all this stuff like normal, however you want to pull this area. Kill Gore Chop, come upstairs, and you grab this Putrid Belcher. You can kill it on your way, potentially, or even pull it into the pull in the Zav wing. Oops. And then you do Zav, and bang, you've got Pride onto all 3 bosses in the downstairs part of the dungeon without having to do any backtracking, just with having to do a skip. So, very cool path. Very nice one. Thanks for sending that in, Hellboy. And yeah, I hope this works well for anybody who's interested in trying this sort of thing out in Theater of Pain. There are some more advanced strategies that if you're willing to do some more shenanigans, skip more stuff, do some more difficult pulls, you could potentially do even better in this place. But this is the kind of thing that I would suggest for the sort of mid-level place. One thing that a lot of really high-end groups are doing, by the way, so this is kind of in conclusion, this is not dungeon specific, but every dungeon is using Invis Pots to skip Prides is something that is a time saver. A lot of the top groups are now doing that on Fortified weeks. It's a lot trickier to do that on Tyrannical week, so I would say that unless you're feeling really confident that you can defeat a boss without a prideful buff, I'd be hesitant to do it, but particularly that 100% Pride, it's very often a good time-saving proposition, and really any other Pride as well that you can get away with. You just pop the Invis Pots as it's spawning, your whole group does it, and you don't have to fight the Pride. Don't know why it works that way now, but it does, so you can avoid fighting the Pride, and you can go and kill the boss. The bosses will be harder, the bosses will take longer. Some bosses will potentially take as long as if you had killed the Pride, but most bosses will take less time than the combined time of the shorter boss plus Pride combo and the Pride fight itself. So it's probably still true on Tyrannical Week, but you run more into that place of, okay, now things are actually getting impossible. So I wouldn't necessarily recommend it, but I figure it's worth updating everybody with what the kind of metagame is looking like if you are interested in actually getting a coordinator group and pushing really high up the ladder. But again, as I said at the start of the video, I don't think the Tyrannical weeks, even with the Tyrannical nerf, I don't think those are going to be the weeks where you'll see that sort of pushing happen so much as the Fortified weeks. And speaking of that, this next Fortified week that we got coming up is a banger. This is going to be a really, really good one for teams pushing really high keys. You're going to see a lot of Mythic Plus on Twitch and stuff, so a lot of teams that potentially could even do fairly well this week are probably going to be saving up, fueling up in the gas tanks, getting ready for a week of gaming. Even MDI competitors can play this week because it's one of the weeks where there's not a cup. It's not a cup weekend. I guess it's a time trial weekend, so it's still potentially tough to play all week. But they can at least get a couple good days in of Bursting Volcanic of the MDI players that are high key pushers as well. So I think this will be a week where you'll see some really high keys pushed. Again, because as I mentioned, we might not be getting back to it ever again. This might be the only time we ever get back to Bursting Volcanic next week, so we'll see. That'll be something I'll talk about more next week, I'm sure, but a lot of exciting patch 9.0.5, patch 9.1 stuff, all that's on the horizon, but that's not this week. This week, of course, is Tyrannical, Quaking, Raging. So good luck in your keys, have fun. Thanks for checking out my video. Check out my stream as well if you like, twitch.tv/Ratnos, where I stream once a week, less often than I should. I'll stream more. Due to the end of my last video last week, I talked about how I was going to make more videos and stream more, and then I just did not do that at all. So hopefully this week I do end up doing that, but no promises. Remember to hit like and subscribe and stuff, and DM me any cool routes, any cool updates you find to any of my routes. As long as a lot of people DM me wanting to add skips to the no skip routes. That's not allowed. I can't do that. There's a really nasty pull, but you have to do it because it's right in the way. You gotta You just got to do it in the no skip strat. That's them's the rules. But anyways, I'm really bad at ending my video. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one. Bye.